Welcome again to our session. My name is Zakia Salim. I am a faculty at Rutgers University, and I teach in both sociology and women's and gender studies. And I'm very, very honored to be part of this event. I want to keep it short. My introduction. I might intervene at the end of all the presentations to just maybe pull some ideas together and suggest some ways in which we can have a conversation. So our first speaker is my colleague and friend, Charlotte Bunch, who is the former director of the Center of Women's Global Leadership, and I think she's very well known to the Rutgers scholars and beyond. And I am really honored to be introducing her as our first speaker on this panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm really thrilled to be following that introductory conversation because I was trying to think about how I could tell you stories about what it was like to organize women globally for the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, because in many ways, as Tony described it, we were the insurgents. Yes. None of us had been in the halls of the UN very much, maybe at women's conferences, but certainly not in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and Commission. And in many ways, I think what we were doing is what he described at the end, which is how new actors enter into and claim human rights for yourself. How groups that have not traditionally had the everydayness of violation in their lives recognized as important, like human rights. And that is very much what the Women's Rights as Human Rights movement, the global campaign, was trying to do, to show that the everyday violations, in this case of women, but I think it's true across the board, are every much serious human rights abuses as any other issue. And this was, at the time, Radhika said it, really sort of unheard of, and we were told many times things like one of the major professional human rights organizations, I won't name, but probably the largest, said that women hijacked the conference in Vienna. And that's because they were not prepared for new actors to claim this, what was, I think, before Vienna, a very professionalized human rights field. So for me, the most important thing about Vienna is not only women's rights as human rights, which is a symbol of that, but also the way in which Vienna opened the door for many new groups. Many more groups from the Global South were present, groups from the indigenous peoples, women, groups that had not traditionally been seen as defining the international human rights agenda. And in that sense, I'm going to talk about women, but I want to say that I think almost all the major breakthroughs in Vienna that happened along with women's rights or human rights also have a very critical and sort of key component about how gender and women are a part of them. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But it was indeed a tipping point for the effort that had begun really in the late 80s as a part of the emergence of global feminism to get women's rights understood as human rights. And it comes out of the World Conferences on Women in Nairobi and that growing sense that women in the world have something to say about all the issues. So women's organizing for Vienna, really the second thing besides them recognizing us was us recognizing ourselves. Women recognizing through the series of conferences in Rio, Vienna, Cairo, Copenhagen, culminating in Beijing, but also going on to Durban and the World Conference of Racism, the food conferences, et cetera, women began to recognize that we were a global power ourselves. And that not only did we have human rights that were violated, but we were not just victims. We were talking about the victim's situation of women in order to assert our power as agents of change. And so it was really a movement of bringing women's agency into the human rights world. And I think that's the most important thing to understand. I'd like to go into more detail, and I've written a longer article, which is on the Center for Women's Global Leadership website, about Vienna Plus 20, because I think some of those lessons have been lost. The global campaign was a ground-up movement. It was North and South. It had women attending all the regional conferences in preparation for Vienna. We had the petition, which has been mentioned, pre-internet. Those of you who've grown up with the internet don't know what a petition was. We received boxes over there in the little office on Ryder's Lane. We received boxes of petitions, some of them signed with thumbprints by women who were illiterate. We received them from 125 countries. We had local movements in grassroots places. This was the beginning of the 16 days of activism against gender violence. And women sent the petition out as part of the 16 days and put it up in battered women's shelters. Here in New Jersey, we had stories of women going into the battered women's shelter and saying, "You mean what happened to me is a human rights issue?" I mean, this is what it means in the practical way of how it empowered women to imagine that things that happen to us, poverty, the lack of housing, the kinds of issues that Tony was talking about, were human rights issues. And we had at least the right to claim redress. We might not have all the channels, and we need to talk today about how we make more channels. But it was that understanding that you have that right, that this is not supposed to be that way, and that the global community has said that. Now, in that process, I think women really put feminism and human rights into dialogue with each other, and in a way that really hadn't been happening before that, although certainly there were women who had tried to do it. And what does that mean to me? It means that the feminist analysis of the separation of the public and the private became a very important vehicle in human rights for understanding that all those violations by non-state actors, whether those non-state actors were family members or multinational corporations, were actually much bigger and much more what was going on in the world than just the state actors. And most of human rights before Vienna was very focused on the state actor. And it still is in those conventions, which is why we have to keep pushing beyond the boundary of the conventions, as well as working with them. And I think that that was an insight that we reinforced from the feminist understanding of how public and private have been separated. Another idea that I think feminists contributed to in this point in human rights was understanding intersectionality. We laughed when people asked us, are women's rights social and economic or political and civil? We were like, what? You know, I mean, there was this big divide you just heard talked about between what were called first and second generation rights. We were like, women's lives? These things all, you know, we have this fancy word, intersectionality, but these things all shape each other. You can't separate out when I'm being abused because I'm a woman or because it's racial or because of my sexuality, or even if you can, it's usually connected to all of those things. That's what intersectionality means. It means you can't just separate out the political from the economic, and you have to look at how these things interface. So I think this was an important part of our contribution to the discussion on indivisibility and the unequivocal understanding when we went to Vienna as a women's caucus that, of course, social and economic rights should be equally important. It seemed to us ridiculous, actually, that these were not even seen as interconnected and equally important. I think that we also contributed a lot to the discussion about the body and sexuality as sites of violations, and that the work that feminist thinking brought, after all, what is torture? Torture is the violation of your body. Human rights probably built its initial reputation on the issue of torture, and torture is what they do to your body. So what we've tried to do is to show that it isn't just state torture. It's all the other ways in which the body and sexuality and the personhood and the integrity is violated by the state or by people who are allowed to violate that, who are non-state actors. So again, I think much of the work in the last 20 years that has been called sexual rights and that has dealt with reproductive rights, with sexual identity, has dealt with sexual orientation and gender identity, is in many ways connected to the breakthrough of women's rights as human rights and feminism on that agenda. Now, what did women gain from all of this? I think that most importantly, we gained those sentences in the document that we could use in our own struggles to make these issues understood. Our goal was not to get Vienna to just say this. It was to use this at the local and national and regional level to reinforce the accountability of governments for issues that women experienced. And in many ways, when you look at how did that help women, you have to look at the chain from Vienna to Cairo and the population conference to the Beijing conference, which becomes really the framework of the Beijing conference is that women's rights are human rights. The whole framework is spelling out in 12 areas what it means to have these human rights. So I don't think of Vienna as just that document, that piece of paper, but what that document helped make happen, helped women continue to do as an organizing tool. And certainly, I think all of the human rights instruments that women now have been actively trying to use, and other countries, particularly the Women's Convention, the CWGL Convention, which we have not ratified in the United States. So there's no question but what the United States has many, many human rights issues, including for women, that struggle to use those instruments to actually try to hold governments and people to those promises has fueled much of the activity of the women's rights movement over the past 2 decades and not solved those problems. I get frustrated when people say, oh, the UN failed. Well, the UN isn't what it's about. The UN is a vehicle. Governments are a vehicle. It's about changing the conditions in our lives and all the institutions, and what pressure we can build as movements utilizing these documents, these institutions, to bring the best for us. And we have a lot to look at in terms of challenges. Okay, one more thing I wanted to say about universality, because without question, one of the gains of the Vienna Conference was the assertion indisputably that human rights are universal, and that their promotion and protection is the legitimate concern of the international community. Now, I'm actually quoting this time from the document because the whole debate that has taken the guise of so-called debate over universality and culture is a sham debate, because the question of universality is not that we all are the same. The question of universality is that we all have the right to claim our human rights and to struggle in our societies for those human rights. And the notion that the international human rights community has to be concerned with that. Now, who has to lead that has to be always the local groups. But the international community should be concerned about women's rights and violations of women's rights. We should just not let our governments manipulate that concern. We must fight to make sure that our concern is in solidarity with the women around the world and led by their definition of how to do with it. I don't think they want us to just go away and to, in a sense, have a double standard about what we care about in our lives versus what happens to them. So I think the whole definition of universality and the debate over culture, and it's not just culture, because culture is everywhere. I don't know a human rights issue that isn't about changing culture. I desperately want to change the gun culture in the United States.
Yes.
I think that's probably one of our most pressing domestic human rights issues, is our gun culture and what's it done to us. And to me, it's very intersectional with violence. It's very intersectional with our militarism, with our multinational corporation-driven industries that drive this gun culture. So culture is everywhere in human rights. Every issue. You can't name a human rights issue that doesn't touch on people seeking to make some changes in their culture. Health rights is a cultural question. Why are we seeing this huge resistance by one portion of the conservative movement to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare? Because they object to the culture of the notion that the government has a responsibility for all its people. Now, that's a fundamental human rights issue, and it's a cultural question. Do you accept the notion that your government has some responsibility for the people? So every issue of human rights has a cultural aspect. The question for me around women is not, is it cultural, but that we are culturally sensitive and aware of how these arguments get used by political forces, including our government, and we don't play into that. And at the same time, we don't abandon the feminist women who exist in every single culture, country, religion in the world who are trying to bring these changes for themselves. And we cannot abandon them in the name of some kind of other cultural something that doesn't exist. We're all in this together, and I think it's crucial to see it that way. In terms of what we do post-me, and I'm going to skip the section on advances because I think my time is running out and go to challenges. To me, we are very much, as I think Tony and Radhika said, we've made enormous advances in terms of the description and development of norms and standards and putting issues on the agenda, maternal mortality, violence against women, issues that weren't ever discussed in human rights circles before. But that doesn't mean that we've gotten very far in changing the reality of those abuses. And that to me is the real challenge today, is how do we take these issues that we've gotten into the international human rights discussion and be sure that they have more power behind them? And how do we do it in a time period when privatization and many conservative groups are pushing back, as I said before, around healthcare, to say that governments and societies don't have this responsibility for each other? And I think human rights is at the core of the question of whether we believe we have some responsibility for being our sisters and brothers, not keepers, but sisters and brothers in solidarity to deal with these issues. So I would like to just suggest that for me, there's about 3 or 4 major challenges that we and the women's rights as human rights and the human rights movement generally need to deal with. The first and most obvious is the growing gap, the inequality gap in the world. The growing gap between women and men who have benefited from these changes, and I'm speaking specifically now about women who have benefited from all these changes, and there are many, many women around the world who have much more options in their lives, including almost all of the students in the back of the room. And those women who have not benefited and have actually been further marginalized by the economy in the last 20 years. And men who've been marginalized by the economy, but women are doubly affected. Women are marginalized, the poorest of the poor, as we say. Women are also the victims of the resentment and alienation of men who've been marginalized. Violence increases in situations where men are alienated and have no hope for the future. If you want to look at an interpretation of what happened in India on that bus, I think is a very clear example of the same thing that happened in Montreal 20 years ago when an engineering student gunned down 14 Canadian women because they got the places in the engineering school that he thought he should have gotten as a man. This is not new, it's not third world, it's everywhere. Men who are alienated are also taking out that violence on women. So women have to deal both with the gap in poverty that they experience and those who are marginalized, and the increased violence that we are seeing because of the inequity that men as well as women experience. So for me, that is the number one challenge for all of our issues. The second challenge that I would put out really is coming more specifically to violence against women, is to understand that violence against women is not some marginalized individual exotic cultural practice or some individual thing that happens to a few women who made a bad choice of a husband. It is a systematic mechanism built into patriarchy for the purpose of confining women's choices in life. So what does it mean that 1 in 3 women throughout the world, including the United States, experience violence? It means that this mechanism that is about enforcing domination is still very much in place. And all our laws and all our efforts to make it a human rights issue haven't yet taken it out of the cultural attitudes of our societies, both women and men's attitudes. So I think we have everywhere, including the US, which has probably the worst statistics about violence against women of any industrialized country. We have a very serious cultural question about the acceptance of violence in our culture and how it perpetuates this system of domination. Now, I think that's important because we're half the population, but it's also important because the acceptance of the domination of half the population and the acceptance of violence against half the population clearly reinforces the acceptance of violence in all its other forms, whether racial violence or violence of war and militarism. If you grow up watching that it's okay for women to be violated or for children to be beaten and violated, of course you're not going to think that the world isn't going to operate that way because that's what you've grown up with. So for me, it's a peace and security issue, which I'm sure Patricia will talk about more, as well as a fundamental issue of women's rights to go and be and do what you want to do in the world. The final issue that I was going to talk about is really how we think about the defense of those human rights defenders. Because to me, one of the other outgrowths of Vienna, which really comes 10 years later in the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, is the Declaration on the Defense of Human Rights Defenders. And I think if you think about where we are in the world today, the backlash against human rights in general and the backlash against feminists in particular is very intense, and that backlash is being taken out on many activists and organizers, LGBT organizers, feminist organizers, abortion providers in the US. These are all human rights defenders, and these are people who are standing up for the human rights, often of marginalized groups, marginalized by sexuality, marginalized by class, marginalized by issues like reproductive rights, that we've allowed this kind of violation of defenders to happen. So I think the third challenge is how do we as communities stand up for those who decide to put their lives on the line for these questions? Indigenous communities, disabled communities, many people over the last 20 years have taken this opening of human rights that women were a key part of, and it is now being resisted because often the indigenous communities are the ones challenging those who want to do environmental degradation, who want to expand so-called development into their places. And they are being violated, not just casually, they are being killed. In the same way that LGBT people are being killed, and you probably know more about that, when they try to speak up in certain places, or that women lawyers all over the world. I have a very good friend in Pakistan, Hina Jalani, very famous. She was almost shot in her office by the family of the woman she was helping to get a divorce because they didn't believe that she had the right to a divorce. And fortunately for her, she survived that attack, but these are the everyday reality of those who fight for these rights. So to me, those are really the tipping points I hope we'll see in 20 years. We saw very critical tipping points in Vienna, but I hope in 20 years we'll see a tipping point in the end to impunity for sexual and racial violence, a tipping point in the creation of enabling conditions for economic rights and justice for all, which means a rebalancing of this incredible economic inequality that we have created in this country and that exists around the world, and a tipping point in the defense of human rights defenders, women and men who struggle for the rights of the marginalized wherever they are in every place. It's more than enough to keep us busy, and I hope we'll have as good a 20 years as the last. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Petralia Guerrero. She is the founder of the League of Displaced Women in Colombia, and she's going to talk to us about her work, and I hope that she's going to mention something about the City of Women, which houses over 500 displaced people that she
the pictures. Yeah, well, this is our women in the picture. Yes, thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me today here. I'm very glad to invited by the Center of Women's Leadership. I'm very grateful to be here and share with you my experience. And I'm also happy to see here friends on the historic friends as Marta Benavides, who are very close to our fights in Colombia. Well, yes, I'm the founder of the oldest displaced women organization in Colombia called the Displaced Women League. This is a women's organization who lead actually in Colombia the process of restitution of land and restitution and reparation for the last, 20 years of displacement in our cases. Yeah. Yes, I'm listening, Charlotte, and I'm start to remind all this hard fight that we did in the last 20 years. That purpose of my job, of my life, really, because I'm mother and grandmother also, is to trespass this historical heritage to the new generations, because we really are in really danger in this moment with all the things that we supposed to get to got in that time. I remember, Charlotte, when I was in the Japan International Tribunal and Comfort Women in Japan together, and we bring the witness from the armed conflict, and I bring and that tribunal women from Colombia. Yes, and the history of the legal resistance that we start, from the Vienna, and after that the fight for the International Criminal Court to put all these crimes against women in the agenda, which mean forced prostitution, forced abortion, sexual slavery, genocide is rape as genocide, and all these kind of crimes against women who never appeared before. You can imagine that genocide happened first, and the rape 100 of women in the República Democrática del Congo or in Yugoslavia, even in other countries. First is the genocide, first is all the hundreds of rape, and then the law came. So this is very difficult, because first is the genocide and second is the law. So how you can work in this kind of situation? But you have to do. So that's what after that experience, Charlotte and all of you, I start to work very hard in what kind of crimes the women of the Liga de Mujeres suffer, and not just a displaced for the war, and displaced for the guerrillas or the paramilitares or these not state actors took the land. But what happened to them regarding their bodies and this kind of human rights violations? Yes, and I found that all the women of our organization suffer a different kind of sexual abuse or rape. So it was the first time that we, tried to figure out what I'm going to do with this in my hand. So because the process of documentation in army situation is very difficult. It's very hard. You became a target of the armed actors in conflict. So we start to work in this issue, but at the same time, we start to work in how rebuild our life and how to get some money to rebuild the life of the women. And I discovered that the house for women are so important, because if you have a roof, si tienes un techo, no, this is, yes, a roof, and you put your head behind. It's really important, because it's the first step that you can to rebuild your life. So I started to figure out, well, we have to do something with this. So we started to work very hard. I was in the Columbia University. I'm very grateful with the human rights advocacy training program when I was there. And I collect some money, and thanks for foundation and other organizations. So I get at least $1 million. And we started immediately to the construction, the City of Women. So it was very hard, because this is a place where the conflict remain, and even now the conflict remain. But we start to work in the construction of the 100 houses for the displaced internal women, and yes, we did it. But the cost was so high, people die, women were raped, husbands of their women were killed. I was threatened many times. And in the last 5 years, we were threatened for the paramilitares 5 times. So what's scary is this, how you can work in these conditions. So, well, I'm start to use the legal resistance, I say, and at least, well, there are not possibility to have a real protection in my country. Even I get sentence of the Constitutional Court, more than 2 or 3 sentences to claim to the state to protect these women, because it's the obligation of the protection, but it doesn't matter, so they continue the threats and everything. And then the response of the states was the militarization of our lives. So they respond with weapons, with bodyguards, with these kind of things, who put the women in another dangerous situation, because this is amazing. When you have to work with people who have arms behind you, this is horrible. This is you can be concentrated. But we start to work in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, of the Inter-American System of Human Rights, and for the first time in the history of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, we got the protection for all the organizations. It's more than 105, más de 150, 150 women were protected by the Inter-American system. But when you start to get protected by the Inter-American system, you became a target not just for the paramilitares and the guerrilla, even for the state actors. Because you are insurgent, you are subverters, you are not obedient. So it was really difficult, because it's not just protection, it's how you get justice, because justice for these women who were displaced and suffering rape and all these kind of things in the armed conflict. And now we have to face the peace process in Colombia with the guerrilla de las FARC, guerrilla of the armed force, Fuerzas Armadas, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, FARC, and the government. So this is another challenge for us, because despite Resolution 3025, and that we also worked very hard in that point, this 13 years ago, there are no women's representation of the civil society in that peace talk. So we are very concerned about this kind of peace negotiation out of the representation of more than the 50% of the population in my country. So yeah, this is the challenge that we have to face every day, and in a long-term conflict as Colombian, because Colombia is not anymore in the international agenda, no, because well, this is a country we have a peace process. They have increased the all the privatizations in the country, and it's a good behavior that the Colombia have actually for the international community, but for us has been recently calculated by the National Center of the Colombian Historic Memory that the internal armed conflict between 1958 and 2012 has caused 220,000 deaths, and 8 of every 10 are civilian. And of these 8, 7 are women. So this is not a good news for the large impunity that we have to face, because this is not impunity just for us in the Liga de Mujeres, it's for all the women who have to suffer this kind of crimes against their own families and etc. Because the number or the internal displaced people in Colombia is more than 6 million, and that 6 million are more than 50% are women, and them children, and in charge of the women. So that the situation that the women we have to face in the post-conflict situation are going to be huge. So. And the poverty is the other range of situation in that the women suffering after the conflict. So we have to face all these things and face the continued demilitarization in our country, because that's the reason of the conflict is the war on drugs, the war on terror, all this kind of war is continuing. So what we're going to do with this war on drugs, or because there is not to stop this thing, which is international trade. It's difficult to stop the kind of criminality or the huge criminality against women in my country, because many of that women, of course, are involved also in this situation. So I just want to share with you this experience. I think many of you know more about these things, but this is my personal experience, and I think we have to face a really big challenge from here to the future. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm allergic to.
Our next speaker is Bernadette Moutian, sorry. You hear me now? Our next speaker is Bernadette Moutian from the Coalition of African Lesbian. She's a writer, a poet, and an activist, and she's going to share with us her experience. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me this way? Cool. I called this little bit of sharing that I'm going to do with you today Jaywalking the Freeway of Love, because I'm both ungovernable and I love words. So in 1993, the year of the Germinal Vienna Conference, the first president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, affirmed that all freedoms and hence oppressions are interdependent. And this, for me, speaks critically to this thing called intersectionality that Charlotte Bunch touched on earlier, which is really the study of the interactions of multiple systems of oppression or discrimination and its intersections with privilege. Intersectionality influenced South Africa's groundbreaking constitutional equality clause, which guarantees the rights of all peoples, including on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI, as some people say. Very soggy, wet Vienna was a groundbreaking intersectional moment for us as well, affirming that human rights is a universal standard and emphasizing the indivisible, interdependent nature of human rights, quoting the Center for Women's Global Leadership, specifically in response to the historic divide between civil and political rights on the one hand and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand. So intersectionality shows how biological, social, and cultural categories like gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, and other axes of identity ad infinitum interact on multiple and often simultaneous levels, contributing to systematic social inequity. Intersectionality holds that the classical conceptions of oppression within society, like this racism, sexism, homophobia, blah, blah, religion, belief-based prejudice, and all that, do not act independently of one another, but instead these forms of oppression interrelate, creating a system of oppression, a sort of a web that reflects the intersection of these multiple forms of discrimination. So there's a tension that exists sometimes between the so-called liberatory powers of so-called identity politics, like black consciousness or queer activisms, and mainstream human rights discourses that often argue for the eradication of differences, but while ignoring these differences within groups, it also exacerbates these tensions among us. So I wanted to share with you, and I couldn't show you PowerPoint, but I wanted to share with you an interesting image devised by a peace researcher called Johan Galtung, culled from his book in 1996, Peace by Peaceful Means, and it depicts a triangulation of violence and non-violence or peace. So if you'll bear with me, if you can just imagine, I'm sure you all have imaginations, yes? One triangle with 3 corners or points, but no single point is static or stays. The triangle can move in any one direction at any point. No one point remains statically on top, unlike patriarchal politics, where the ironically named missionary position reigns supreme. So each point of the triangle represents one of 3 interrelated forms of violence, with its antithesis, non-violence or peace. The first point then represents direct or personal violence, like a man, for example, hits a woman. The second point depicts structural violence, which is violence embedded in the very structures of society, like sexism, racism, homophobia, or heterophobia for that matter. The third point denotes cultural violence, which speaks to the mindsets that underpin structural and direct violence, like victim blaming in the case of rape. What were you doing walking in the middle of the day on the college? Don't you know about frat boys? So in this way, Galtung's triangulation of violence and non-violence shows that human rights cannot be realized while cultural violence, which supports structural and direct violence, continues. All forms of violence need to be eradicated for the so-called positive peace to be realized, with positive peace implying much more than merely the absence of war or conflict. In other words, speaking of a human security, which means the fulfillment of all aspects of what it means to live a full and dignified life in harmony with one's community and environment. So one realizes that mere tinkering with legislation or even enacting path-breaking constitutions like South Africa's in the 1990s is simply not enough. Gender-based violence, the rape of lesbians and murder of gay men because of their sexuality continues unabated, despite this powerful legislation and policies. So beyond our vexations about transforming structural violences, we're being challenged to transform our mindsets or our consciousness so that cultural violence can be completely eradicated. Post-conflict societies like the beautiful Colombia and South Africa show the impacts of colonial violences on contemporary people, especially historically marginalized women and LGBTQIs. South Africa is one of the world's highest gender violence rates precisely because of decades of apartheid, centuries of brutal genocidal slavery and colonialism. Global terrorism also shows that the global north can never be free of violence, while the global south remains terrorized. Economically, politically, and otherwise. And the recent massacre in an upmarket Kenyan supermarket shows that not even the privileged in the global south are safe in the exclusive gated estates where some of my best friends live in South Africa and elsewhere. So for me, no one is innocent or immune from violence. It impacts on all of us. While we are familiar with victims suffering from violence, most obviously, we often forget that witnesses suffer vicarious trauma and that most perpetrators are themselves survivors of violence, including gender-based violence, that violence and discrimination often stems from insecurity and fear rather than a lustful nature, no mirth intended. The Coalition of African Lesbians is a broad, deliberately feminist network of people classified women at birth whether they were born intersex or whatever, but they were classified women at birth, who from time to time have sex with other women and or other people. So the identities of members of CAL include lesbian, trans, women, intersex, bisexual, asexual, celibate, indigenous fluid like me, human ad infinitum, the whole spectrum of what it means to be a human being. So our challenges are less about labels or these issues which we are still dealing with, like sexualities and genders, and the intersections with a wide range of oppressions and privileges, which really have not changed much over decades. Our challenge, we suggest, centers on the approaches taken, what we think is an imperialist or colonial gaze, and how we conceptualize these issues, how these lenses shape the activisms we engage in. This includes what we feel is a very narrow LGBTQI discourse, with European letters completely ignorant of and sidestepping ancient same-sex practices on all continents, which includes woman-to-woman marriage in Africa. Ifi Amadioumi and the late Audre Lorde had a famous spat about whether these women across Africa had romantic sexual relations, which is what Audre argued, or whether it was entirely about property relations and ensuring succession of property, which is Ifi's contention. This ancient practice was almost entirely eradicated by colonial Christianity, yet it still persists, especially in rural areas across East, Central, and West Africa. Beautiful African women at conferences approach one with some pride to declare that their mothers or grandmothers were married in this way, even if the practice is now riddled with colonial-induced stigma and obviously not as widespread as in the past. Our struggles also concern the classification led by the global north of the rape of lesbians, ostensibly due to their sexuality, as a hate crime. This divorced the so-called corrective or curative rape from its rootedness in gender-based violence and an analysis and challenge of patriarchy, effectively de-radicalizing a revolutionary moment. While conducting focus groups in the greater Cape Town area across class and other divides on the topic of so-called curative rape, I encountered one young educated black woman who shared her experience of her being raped by her neighbor. She apparently refused his initial romantic overtures, so he forced himself on her, claiming that he was showing her how to be a so-called real woman and curing her of her lesbianism to boot. So I asked her if she would still have been raped if she wasn't a lesbian. And she reflected for a few moments and stunningly said to me, absolutely yes, he would have raped her because she's a woman, she's a vagina, irrelevant of whether she, what her sexual identity is, because he felt he had power over her body and she had no autonomy over her body or her sexuality. So this incident for me partly reflects the connectedness of the rape of people because of their sexuality with gender-based violence more generically, and how that fits in with patriarchy, which identifying it with hate crimes strips it of that power and depoliticizes it. There are also further complexities around especially women's sexuality in places like South Africa, where there's a high HIV and AIDS rate, including, interestingly enough, among women who have sex with women, whether they identify as lesbian or not. Questions about this include whether the sex between women and men are consensual, as there are in some instances, with some women identified as lesbian happily having sex with some men. Still, to what extent does the often violent early onset of sexuality impact on this HIV transmission? In other words, if almost half of all girls and some boys are raped by other men, often raped repeatedly throughout their lives, for real, and sometimes often by multiple perpetrators, as in what we might call gang rape, however defined, whether it's 4 cousins or 5 uncles. And how does this early onset of violent sexuality impact on the HIV transmission and the reiteration of violence as victims and perpetrators, both in interpersonal relations like domestic violence or battery, as well as outside the home, making our country, for example, and our continent excessively violent? We feel that we need to ask deep and challenging questions that may leave many of us uncomfortable. Challenge and discomfort for us affords spaces of transformation, which at times can be liberatory, and affords some freedom from the traditional enclaves of normativity. The silification of our discourse and struggle speaks to a weakness, a poverty of the global imagination. We feel we need to indigenize our struggles. We need to use language that is familiar to local peoples the world over, so that tyrannical patriarchal leaders cannot say our practices are un-African or un-Russian or un-whatever, because they are indeed indigenous, and we have been doing it since time began. That's why we have populations, because we have been procreating in various interesting ways. With indigenous knowledge, we can more effectively resist the flood of fundamentalist Christians from North America and Europe that's recolonizing our continents in floods, plane loads, truckloads of these missionaries coming to us, aided by tyrants more interested in scapegoating marginalized communities than in addressing critical issues of socioeconomic justice. We also need to remind ourselves that violences are structural, cultural, and due to patriarchy, women are at the center of this war on our bodies and our minds. Yes, some boys and men do get raped. Yes, some women are perpetrators. But these are by far the minority of sexual violence cases. The vast majority of victims are girls and women of violences perpetrated by men. This places culpability squarely at the feet of patriarchy and challenges us to dismantle patriarchy in its entirety, rather than to merely tinker with legislation and policies, even as we recognize the importance of these so-called paper rights. So while we focus on choice, autonomy, desire, and pleasure, we need to remember that we need socioeconomic cultural rights to be truly free. It's much more fun loving someone, irrespective of genitals, in fields of daisies, Bollywood or Nollywood style, than it is to huff and puff in a dark, dusty, claustrophobic closet. Just as it is much lovelier, unless one is a necrophile, that's a lover of cadavers, to love someone who is healthy, well-fed, and equally energetic than to romp with a starving, emaciated, blood-spitting, wound-covered victim of patriarchy. So I am often celibate by choice for various reasons. One of the co-founders of the Coalition of African Lesbians identifies as lesbian and loves to have sex with anyone, irrespective of genitalia, as often as she can, and even with men, whether singly or in groups, to the horror of many other people, but not to me. The current director of CAL said to me recently, "Hey Bernie, I'm getting old. I now have only 3 lovers." Some people would be mortified. You know, she's not harming anyone. Our struggles centrally concern freeing ourselves from the claustrophobic boxes of heteronormativity and homonormativity, and to reclaim our indigenous fluidities, which respects each human and being as part of a community and environment. The world's a beautifully diverse place, like all the beautiful people, really truly beautiful people in this room. It takes all sorts to make a rainbow. Love and desire is less in the eye than it is in the mind of the beholder. And to conclude, as the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa, brutally slain by apartheid security guards during the 1970s, said in a speech in my mother city of Cape Town, and I'm quoting him, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." And we all know Bob Marley's old song, most of us, "None but ourselves can free our minds." Thank you.
I was so taken by all these interventions. Our next speaker and last speaker is Anita Nair, and our next speaker is Anita Nair, and she's going to talk to us about her embeddedness in the United Nations process about human rights, and that's really a very good place to be when we are talking about Vienna.
Thank you. Thank you for the Center for Women's Global Leadership for inviting me. I was very inspired by that opening session between Radhika and Anthony and LaShawn, and by this panel as well, and especially by the very poetic and beautiful reflections of Bernadette. So I'm Anita Nair, as you just heard, and I was with, and still feel I am with, the women's movements for the last 18 years with autonomous civil society groups, primarily in the Global South. And in the last 5 months only, I've joined the dark side. I'm with the United Nations now, with actually a very innovative and very creative office called the United Nations Non-Governmental Liaison Service, NGLS. And our role really is to link civil society on substantive issues to the UN process. So just in the last 5 months, it's been a huge eye-opening experience to be on this side. And I want to share some reflections stepping back from my role with women's movements and stepping forward in my role at the UN. So, I mean, we're here to really, celebrate and reflect on this landmark agreements of Vienna 20 years ago. And I think we should be aware of that these achievements of the 1990s were not constructed in a tidy, sort of linear historical way, and that each era, especially that era, has a lot of paradoxes, and that we need to be mindful of. And that the drive to actually achieve those outcomes came from social justice and women's rights movements in really contesting those paradoxes and giving shape to the results. So if we step backward, as was discussed in the opening panel, as we know, the whole creation of human rights instruments came about after World War II, the horrible experience of Nazism, national liberation struggles all across the global South, and of course the weight of the Cold War. So it was, again, not states, but human rights and social justice movements that really pushed the UN to focus on human rights. And women were very much a part of these movements and of national liberation struggles across the Global South in particular. Major achievements were won at that time, as Radhika mentioned in the opening session. There was the creation of the Commission of the Status of Women in those years, in the late 40s. The Convention on the Political Rights of Women. So these were early achievements that came about through women's rights movements in that very contested political time. So while the first generation of rights, if you want, focused on state violations, how do we ensure that people are somehow protected from the state, and what kind of obligations states have to behave well, no one was talking about non-state actors at that time until really the 1990s. So all of that came about in a very complex time of the Cold War, and as Anthony mentioned, this kind of divide between the former Soviet Union defending civil and political rights, and along with China actually, and the United States defending. The former Soviet Union and China defending economic, social, cultural rights, and the United States more interested in civil and political rights. But this era is also complicated by a period of capitalism, the golden era of capitalism of the 1950s. It's, where everyone was growing, including communist and socialist states. It was a period of great technological changes, and a number of emerging states coming into post-colonial, newly independent states. And I think it was also the period of the United States' dominance in the economic realm through the Bretton Woods institutions and the establishments of those as really defining development of that era. So it's not really until the end of the Cold War and the end of an era, whether for good or for bad, that we have this very unusual opportunity to expand the scope of human rights. So what was not possible in 1968, was it, the Tehran conference that collapsed over this divide? What was not possible in 1968 was finally possible in 1993 through the Vienna Conference on Human Rights. But this was also the period of several other major international agreements, and the 1992 Conference on Environment and Development that resulted in a set of Rio Principles. And if you read the Rio Principles, it's like a manifesto of human rights for people and the planet. And I actually graduated college in that year and was so inspired by the Rio Principles and the human rights agreements, and those two really very much frame the work that I've carried out in the last 18 years. Those were realized in different conferences, as Charlotte said, in the Beijing conference in '95, where those principles were applied to every aspect of our lives. And there were 12 chapters, in the Beijing conference, which enshrined women's rights as human rights in every aspect and enshrined issues of sustainability in them as well. In the same year was a major conference. Okay, I'm seeing all the peanut gallery noddings. Not sure if sustainability was enshrined fully in the agreements, but human rights was, and that's and it's true. The issues of sustainability and overconsumption and production were continuously watered down after Rio, and that's a big fight to bring back on the agenda today, to understand the interlinkages between human rights and sustainability. The same year in '95 was a conference on social development, and this was a landmark conference really that brought in women's rights in the macroeconomic policy arena and looked at how the implications of issues like structural adjustment policies and debt and so on were actually eroding women's rights, and why gender equality and women are central to any macroeconomic policy making. So these were great achievements, as I said, in this very unusual period post-Cold War. Now, toward the end of that process, in 2000, was it, the Financing for Development Conference? Was that 2000 or 2002? 2000.
2002.
2002, right. So in 2002, at this Financing for Development Conference, it was supposed to be the culmination of all these great agreements and finally a platform for development assistance and financing. But at that same year, this was, in the 90s, what I say, the paradoxes, that's during the same period of these, achievements on the human rights side, we see the rise of the World Trade Organization. And the rationale that somehow all development issues can be resolved through markets and through international trade. And this was very much the framework that we start hearing in the late 90s and in the 2000s. So that's still the framework that we're operating in today, and with the Millennium Development Goals, as you know, due to expire in 2015, the debate about what the next development agenda is really in full swing right now at the United Nations. And governments have initiated discussions, some with civil society. The United Nations is integrally involved in this process to really see what the future development agenda will look like and what this next generation of goals will be. So questions are, where will issues of human rights, sustainability, and macroeconomic issues be? How will they be embedded in these new goals? Or will we fall back on this very narrow sectoral approach that we've been living with for the last 15 years? So the United Nations launched 4 reports recently in the last couple of months that are shaping this whole discussion. And what my office did, the NGLS office, was to engage a consultation with civil society to review these 4 reports and really put forward recommendations. So the 4 reports are the high-level panel report of the Secretary General, which is a group of eminent people that the Secretary General selected to reflect on this for about a year. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which looked at issues of sustainability led by Jeffrey Sachs. The Global Compact, which is private sector views. And the 4th is the UN Development Group, which really reflects a lot of the thematic and national consultations that have been going on. And in the process of conducting our consultation, we did this in 4 languages, in 14 teleconferences in 8 regions of the world. People were very concerned that the emphasis on the private sector through each of these processes was, it was very imbalanced, and there was far too much emphasis on private sector views. And interestingly, across every region of the world, roughly a third of the issues and recommendations that came forward really were looking at the global structural obstacles to development. So the first very clear message that came through was the need to rebalance power for justice, which really looks at the structural transformations that are required at the global level in order to make the realization of rights and the right to development possible. Participants pointed, for example, to trade and investment rules, the international financial institutions, and in some regions, the issues of militarization. They said that these power structures are constraining the capacity of countries to develop their own policy tools and are actually impinging on people's rights, especially around critical services such as water, energy, food, health, education. I mean, these were all examples that were brought out in the regional discussions of how these are affecting day-to-day lives. And they said that these structural obstacles to development is actually what is driving poverty and inequality. The second key message that came through the consultation was to fulfill human rights. And so the human rights framework, and that includes the full United Nations human rights architecture, was seen as the pillars for moving forward. But realizing that those pillars still exclude too many people. And so the need to overcome exclusion must be part of this debate. So it's not simply enough to say all human rights for all, but to really look at those communities all across the world that are historically and continuously excluded and how to make that visible. The third strong call was to ensure the equitable distribution and safe use of natural resources. And here participants spoke to issues of human rights as inextricably linked from care for the planet. So that the destructive practices go hand in hand with violations of human rights in every single region. And here issues of extractive industries was high on the agenda for every region, including North America and Europe. Less so in Europe, but certainly in North America. So issues of land and resource grabs really framed kind of the escalating realities of climate change, and that these must be seen as absolutely urgent and central to the debate moving forward. So obviously finding solutions to all of these, whether it's the power imbalances at the macro level or the human rights instruments or the safe use of natural resources, requires a kind of regulatory framework and accountability of those who are violating rights and are destroying the environment. And I think what the strong call was for people to be engaged in governance, whether the decisions happen close to home or whether they happen thousands of miles away, that there must be a sense of participatory democracy in this. I'll just give you a couple of examples. For example, just to elaborate on the links between rights, sustainability, and macroeconomic policy. For example, around food security, a critical issue in the post-2015 agenda, and participants pointed to, again, the critical role that women play in sustaining food security, whether it's through traditional sustainable agricultural practices or traditional seed supply systems and so on, but understanding that these are under severe threat because governments are actually prioritizing export-oriented agribusiness, and the issues of corporate control over food production and speculation in agricultural commodities is actually completely threatening these fundamentals that we need to protect to sustain food security. Employment, another big issue in the post-2015 agenda, a key issue. But the goal of full employment, even if we were to agree to such a goal, which is unlikely, but even that goal of full employment cannot be achieved for half of the population if we don't tackle the unequal distribution of unpaid care work. So, this conventional approach to full employment, it's based on as my teachers, Radhika and Diane, have taught me, is based on a male breadwinner model. The full-time employee that works and after hours, that works after hours but spends very little time in care work at home. Or any household chores. So how can you actually address employment if you don't address the unpaid care work and the gender wage differential as well? These issues are not on the table in the 2015 agenda and very much need to be. Universal health care, a third example, strongly on the agenda by some vested interests, again, does not address sexual and reproductive health and rights. I think we need to really move away from a very narrow view of healthcare and health coverage, actually, and really expand it to look at health care, including sexual and reproductive health care, and really look at the wide range of what is the wide range of rights, including bodily autonomy and integrity. This is linked to the fourth issue I'd like to raise, which is public-private partnerships. While billions of dollars are paid are spent to bail out the banks, the rhetoric, the discourse at the global level is that states don't have the resources to invest in public goods, and development assistance is shrinking. So there's an increasing reliance on the private sector to actually invest in public goods, in so-called public-private partnerships, and including in healthcare and in key public utilities like water and electricity and others. So it's not just investing in them; it's actually managing them as well. And so participants really called for a serious investigation into the private sector as an actor in development, and saying we need to monitor and control these, what they called cartels and corporate concentration. We need to establish regulatory measures and mechanisms. We need to call back for a global mechanism like the UN Center for Transnational Corporations, which used to exist in the 70s and was defunded and closed. Basically really rethinking the role of the private sector in development. So I think these are just 4 examples to show that the challenge for us is to really look at the structural transformations that are required in order to realize human rights, women's human rights, and development for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very inspiring and insightful presentations. I would like to just probably propose 3 or 4 ideas around which we can have open a conversation. And I would like to just say a few words about the process. And I'm trying to respond also to the first panel in which there was a conversation, a discussion about whether the language of human rights or human rights are exported or should be exported, and that this is a conversation that feminist circles were having, and women were having also in activist circles around the world. Is it a question of exporting it? So going back to the process and the Vienna Conference, what we heard and what some of us are very familiar with is that the Vienna Conference is actually the outcome of a process, and that process did not start by a few government officials sitting in a room and deciding that they are going to change the language, but it started because thousands of women and men were fighting for their basic rights, and that did not necessarily start in Europe. If we want to talk about the way in which my own father, who was a self-educated man who went to school when he was 20 years old, because he was involved in the nationalist movement, and being involved in the nationalist movement for independence in Morocco meant to him being able to read and write. So he went back to school. He went to school as an adult. He was an artisan, but he went to school as an adult to learn how to read and write. So he will know what kind of tracts what kind of leaflets he's distributing. So he can read the contents of the leaflet. So I'm saying that there is a way to look at human rights as grounded and situated in personal experiences, but also in collective resistance to colonialism or to war or to gender oppression or sexual oppression. So just going back again to the process and in a few words, before Vienna took place, and this is what we heard in all those presentations, we should also keep in mind that the so-called NGOs or women's groups played an amazing role before Vienna and after Vienna and during Vienna. And I'm thinking of the Nairobi conference, for example, which was one of the first conferences in which the women's movement was recognized as a movement, and women's NGOs were recognized as active and as actors in the United Nations process. Language, which is the second element I would like to speak to, the language of human rights, of women's rights as human rights, was crucial to us, myself included, when we were fighting for changing family laws across the North Africa and the Middle East. And what the shift in defining human rights, women's rights as human rights did is that it provided us with a legal mechanism to be able to speak about equality, because we didn't know how to speak about equality. And Vienna Conference was that moment in which we were able to use a legal language which would hold not only our own government accountable, but also the international community accountable to its own platforms for action, like in what happened in Beijing conference, for example. However, I'm also very sensitive to the issue of colonizing language and decolonizing language. And what we've heard in some of those presentations is all the questions around human rights framework as a valid framework to talk about women's, to talk about gender oppression, which is multi-sided, multi-faced, as we know. So I just want to keep this open because I don't want to take too much of your time. So there is the issue of decolonizing language, but there was also the question of inclusiveness: who is included, who is not included in that framework, and how to struggle to include, to have as many people as possible as included, and as many experiences and indigenous knowledge and needs included into that framework. The third element that I want to speak to is the ongoing relevance of structural violence as a nexus through which we can look at, and we should be looking at, the issue of human rights. So human rights, women's rights, is not only a question of private, what happened, domestic violence against women, but it happens at the nexus of micro and macro economic policies, micro and macro structures that are organizing and regulating women's lives across the globe. And if we want to think about this as a process again, we can talk about structural adjustment programs in the 1980s, economic liberalization that paved the way for the privatization of basic services during the 1990s, and what we see now happening, and maybe I'm going to end here, what we see now happening is that this is very relevant now to predominantly maybe mainstream white audiences in Europe and the United States. We don't have to struggle too much as we used to explain that privatization means you lose your job, you lose your retirement benefit, you have no access to hospitals, and that we live in an era now, 2 days or 3 days of government shut down, which is like around the world people are telling me what does this mean that the government shuts down? Like, is it a store? How can a government shut down? So we are seeing, and to me this could be a major shift really in our struggle together. We talked about being sisters and brothers, but I think this is really a great moment for us to think of ourselves as sisters and brothers, and maybe we have less difficulty convincing more people to join in, because when we see what's happening in Greece or in Italy or in Spain or in France or here in the United States, people are not screaming that much like in Europe, but now more people are getting it. More people are getting the connections between privatization, undermining governments, undermining public sectors, and their impact on women's lives. My last point is that with the Arab Spring, which is, we can't really just do this without mentioning at all what's happening and what has been happening in the Middle East and North Africa. With the Arab Spring, what we see this emergence again of, I wouldn't say, it's not emergence, it's really an increase, I don't find a more powerful word to talk about it, in gender violence and sexualized violence against women, which is getting to the mainstream. So you open any news channel and that's what you hear, that's what you see. So this is again another way in which we can look at the cases that we don't have, but unfortunately, hopefully we don't only have cases of violence, we also have cases, Radhika, and we have a lot of cases. Her center is a case. So the changes of family law that happened across some of the Muslim world are our cases. So we do have cases. We do have cases in which women have actually changed the law by using the language of human rights and by using the language of women's rights as human rights. So we need to have a case here when the women in this country would be able to get their government, our government, because I just became a citizen, to ratify the CEDAW Convention, which has been ratified by most governments around the world, including my own. So we still do have struggles. So I'm going to end here, and I hope that I was provocative enough to raise more questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want from the panel to respond, or you want?
I think what we could do is to just open it to questions, right? Because we have a half hour. So shall we just take question now? I think, yeah.
But we get to respond at some
point. Yes, absolutely, yes. Okay, why don't you please just form a line behind the mic, and then just ask your question.
Can't hear.
Yeah. Just keep your question short, please. Okay. So there is a mic here also for the people sitting at the front.
Public-private partnerships. I mean, that's the time, the discourse of my government. I want to show them.
It's on? Great. Thank you so much for the great discussion. I'm a postdoctoral fellow from Columbia University.
You have to speak
into it. And my question was to all panelists that's interested in this question, but also especially to Professor Bunch. I was thinking, if you consider posing the question of gender inequality as a global public good, because there's so much discussion both at the international law level as well as the UN discussions on global public goods and how can we raise innovative financing to raise more funding for those. And I fear that gender equality is not actually posed as a global public good, and it's always left out of the agenda towards sustainable development. For example, green technologies or climate change towards more green technologies, it's seen as a global public good, and there's so much mobilization of funding towards that. So do you consider that this question of creating global equality can be considered as a global public good, and that funds for international taxation through different mechanisms can be used actually to fund some of the global gender interventions? Thank you.
Do you want to take several questions,
Yes,
or do you want us to respond?
Why don't we take a few more questions, like 2 more questions, if there are any questions here? Then
Then
yeah,
we
just
can
go
respond,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, you want? There's a microphone there. Oh, circulate more.
Thank you. That was really an inspiring panel. And I had a question about patriarchy, because it's something I struggle with in the formation of my portfolio at Ford, which is to say that my portfolio is domestic and global. And I'm going to talk about the U.S. as a part of the world, because I think we often forget that. And I feel like a lot of the U.S. discourse on women's rights, 1, is absent, and 2, when it is present, is not rooted in an analytic framework that is about deconstruction of patriarchy or challenging of sexual or gender normative behavior. And I'm just wondering whether strategically and in terms of like reaching a broader audience and deepening engagement, issues of patriarchy or framing it as patriarchy is accessible to a lot of people. Because I feel like that's kind of the devil or the elephant in the room. This is like a power discourse and a challenging of power that is patriarchy. And so long as you never say that, particularly in the US, we're kind of frittering around the edges of it all. And it's a little bit frustrating. So I welcome your feedback.
I think there's no one.
Yeah.
Just go ahead.
Oh, just one more here.
Okay,
Then
one more.
We'll just go down and respond to different things.
I just want to go back to a comment that was made in the last session by Anthony. He said that the golden age of human rights was yet to come. And I think I really want to hear from you what opportunities and strategies you think are really needed to put in place to ensure that this is really a generational dialogue. I've been part of the process. One of the processes, Anita's book of high-level panel on post-2015. And I think it was extremely encouraging, despite the fact that we don't want to see it, but it was extremely encouraging that the maximum reinforcements, at least on gender and women's rights, came from groups who don't call themselves women's groups. How do we really strengthen that connection? How do we recognize it? And essentially make new friends and really ensure that the voice that we're bringing to the table is not just from us, but many, many more people.
We had just taken. We'll take another round of questions unless you want to collect all your questions now.
Just collect.
Okay, then go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting panel discussion. And my question will build on the last question, and it is about strategy. As feminist organizers, how do you see, or what would you suggest in terms of feminist strategizing moving forward, particularly keeping in mind keeping states accountable to human rights obligations, but also increasingly thinking about the role of the private sector as a medium through which development, writ large, is going to be facilitated? How should feminists be organizing also in relation to the private sector? Thank you.
Do you want to go? You want to just go down? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have about 5 pages just in response to Sakia as well as the questions, so I'll try to just pick up on a couple and trust my colleagues will take others. I did actually want to reaffirm something you said, Sakia, about the importance of understanding that the human rights language is not just from the North. I have to say that I did not use human rights language when I was in the US. It was 10 years of working with women in the Global South in the 1980s that convinced me that we should be framing women's rights as human rights. And I think it's really unfortunate that because human rights has been dominated organizationally by organizations from the North, and the concepts have been identified with that we still don't fully understand the degree to which it is the Southern-based groups, both women and groups fighting military dictatorships and groups dealing with issues like the desaparecidos and indigenous people's struggles, that really revitalized human rights in that period pre-Cold War that enabled us to burst forth, as I think you said correctly, Anita, in the post-Cold War moment. So for me, women's rights is human rights. You know, when I was doing that work in the early 90s, it was with women from Latin America, with women from the Philippines, which is the first place I ever heard the phrase, by the way, in the 80s, which is not to say it came from there, it's just to remind everybody it came from many places. And many of those were in the Global South. It was women in Latin America who'd been part of liberation and anti-military struggles. It was women in Europe who were refugees of the Bangladeshi war, who had been, faced with honor crimes and no country that would take them in after they'd been raped in war, which is, back in the 1970s, Bangladesh, Pakistan. I mean, these things didn't all start with Bosnia or with Vienna. This was growing on the ground, just as you said. And it was that interaction that convinced me that we could actually try to build something that would help us get out of our silos through the human rights framework, because I think several people have spoken to the danger of both women's groups, but also all of our social justice movements, especially in the US, to fall into single issue or identity politics groupings where we are siloed. And I think that is the biggest large-scale political challenge today that several panelists have spoken to, which is how we all joined those identity groups. I did it with women, I did it with lesbians, I've done it in many places, because those perspectives were missing. But if we stay there and we don't get those perspectives fully integrated, that we'll never get to that place that we're all trying to go. So I think the challenges that many of us are looking at are in this movement of that intersection between the particular, which identity groups and all our particulars have to be named, and we're not finished doing it, and I think Bernadette spoke to that, is also brought together. And for me, human rights, there's nothing sacrosanct about human rights, but it was the vehicle that many of us began to see for trying to express that, which is not to say it's a vehicle without problems. But I think that history has been very misinterpreted by the Western media and done all of us a disservice by focusing on, us in the West, on Hillary, on all of us, instead of focusing on the origins of these ideas. So just that's in terms of women. And I just want to, I could say 10 more things, but I'll just say 2 more. In terms of the question of patriarchy, and I have been struggling for many years, LaShawn, what is the word we can use? We definitely, I'm finding again, it is women from the Global South who are reusing patriarchy. We used it and we were all put down for it. But now I see it coming from, again, the Global South, and I'm like, okay, this word has to be reinterpreted with a new context. But I think the challenge is not just patriarchy. The challenge in this, particularly in relation to the US, is to get people to think systemically. Yeah. To think about systems. It's what you were saying, Savi, to think that these things don't just happen individualistically one by one. Yeah. And we are so conditioned in the United States to individualism. Yes. That I would use patriarchy, but I wouldn't use patriarchy by itself. I would use patriarchy embedded in capitalism, patriarchy embedded in particular kinds of interpretations of religion, patriarchy, whatever. I mean, I think it's those connections that we need to be making, and that really defeats us the most in the US, because even people now, and this is driving me crazy because it comes to your global public goods question, even people who are now saying women and girls are the answer, which they're saying at the World Bank and the Clinton Global Initiative and places, but they're not understanding that changing things for women and girls is about changing the whole system. Yeah. So if we just get a few more school buildings built for women and girls, and the girls can't go to those schools because they haven't understood that the problem wasn't the lack of buildings, or even just, you know, a few more examples of a couple of girls rising who were terrific, but we don't understand that it's a systemic problem, not just individual. I mean, to me, that's the strategy. The strategy is, how do we get this conversation out of the silos without denying any of the diversity?
Yeah.
Which is, how do we keep all those levels of diversity and more that we probably haven't even seen without having to have them siloed into separate places so that they all can feed into a larger systemic analysis and therefore a potentially powerful social justice movement. And I agree with you, there's potential for that in the US, but we have so much work to do in re-educating people about what it means to think about these problems politically. So I'll stop there. Right. I'll let you go ahead.
Well, I want to back to this images of masculinity that we face today. And I remember the president of Russia and the president of Italy, these two really rich and powerful guys, in front of the media, and to have to face a process where they collected girls for their own, and everybody is loud about, how these guys have the power to get everything, there's money, power, women, and it's like girls, and they are involved in the process, because the opposition, political opposition, said, well, this is impossible to happen in this country. No, that happened, and it's legal, and there are no problem. So this kind of images for all the world, this kind of presidents, even here in this country, that start with Reagan is this kind of guy who became from the Hollywood and all this kind of thing, and what happened with Clinton, and nothing happened with these guys. They are so powerful. They have a presence. They have money. All the legal system is in their own hands. So this is the imagine that the young people in this country want to have, because they're really behind that are a system of mafia. Because it's really very scary how these are connected with the drugs trade. They are connected with many things related to arms trade, to forced prostitution, or the new forms of slavery. So this is not really funny, because there are a lot of money behind of that, a lot of suffer for women and in the poverty, because that countries, despite appear like, very rich country, there are many poverty in that countries. And that is really scary, because in the situation of the last required that the president of the United States said, and the Security Council, that they have to stop, this chemical aggression against a community in Syria. They say, that these guys, the Russians say no. So we have to think in the balance in the power in the Security Council, and the balance of the power, what's happened inside of that, because there are a lot of money. I think that all the money of the world in this Security Council, in these five, and we don't thinking about the relationship with this guy with the private sector, and I think there are many things to investigate or research. What is the connection with this and the private sector and the illegal sector? Maybe I'm going to burn after this speech, but I think we have to rethink in all this kind of relationship because the state now are really connected with these guys of the illegal sectors. The illegal sectors, arms trade, cocaine, no cocaine, this kind of drugs trade, and women's trade, new forms of slavery. So this is illegal or became legal, or what is the image that this kind of masculinity wants to show us? No, that are my questions.
Great.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay. We have plenty of microphones, more microphones than...
We are only one.
We have more microphones than human rights. Oh, sorry. Better? Cool. I don't like these instruments in my face. Like my sister over there was concerned about the cameras today, not to be in her face. It's very invasive. I was deeply moved by the sharings of everyone this morning, and probably will be the whole day. And in particular, Anita's speaking about the ways in which global capital has been manipulating matters around the world. And it resonated so deeply with me, because I grew up as a child activist against apartheid and went to prison for that privilege as a youngster, when in school still. And I've done spent some time, not just in prison, but researching transnational corporations, and named one paper, Wars Are Us, to illustrate the power of private security and the increase in it globally. And that was many years ago. And that's just increased from South Africa to Brazil to China. And so I was deeply moved by Anita, because I was intimately involved with the struggle to prevent my government from privatizing water in the late 1990s, so soon after our liberation in 1994. It shocked us deeply as activists that our state could do such an unconscionable thing. And this germinal moment when they sold water to private corporations with enormously disastrous results. Many other things have been allowed in my country, a bit like Obama appointing a former head of the GMO to a key position in the United States. So selling our indigenous knowledge, from seeds to pharmaceuticals and so on. And indigenous scholar Andreas Smith refers to the academic industrial complex as well, and the ways in which that rapes knowledge, especially anthropologists and natural scientists going into places like the Kalahari and mining the ancient knowledge and healing thingamajigs there. So I wanted to also ask questions like, to what extent does we all performing around this Arab Spring, and we're assuming that people are acting as autonomous or independent agents, but to what extent does the global North's greed for oil or fuel drive, no irony intended, this very Arab Spring? I mean, it relates to the transition in South Africa to some extent, where when Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, exactly a day before my birthday, and it was such an awesome experience. But he had already set up that very day meetings with the leaders of the mining industry, mining companies in my country, who were arguing that the transition in South Africa would not be peaceful unless their capitalist interests could be guaranteed. And so our key activists were sent off to the World Bank and the IMF to study economics. The widely lauded Trevor Manuel, our first Minister of Finance, learned his economics not anywhere but here, on the east coast of the United States, from these very institutions that have caused such grave injury to all of us. So, and all the time, we as civil society members were arguing around, what are you all doing? What happened to development, etc.? And they kept referring to Chile and the overthrow of Salvador Allende, and they were saying that, they feared that would happen in South Africa as well. And it relates to the extent, how much we speak of state sovereignty and holding governments accountable, but how sovereign, how independent, autonomous, and agentic are these states really in view of global capital interests? Also, we've been saying for some time, and ironically, my neoliberal government has been saying the same thing, that the state can't provide for you. You have to help yourself. Go and plant, backdoor gardens, which is what we're doing in some of the so-called shanty towns around the continent and the world. But so the government, the state is not going to help you, and bloody hell, get with the program. Global capital is not going to help us. So if global capital is machinating or controlling development on our behalf, not really on our behalf, on their own behalf, then that's not going to help us. So we're not going to get no development that serves us or suits us. It'll serve particular interests and for particular reasons. And when we're wanting to ask where lies the problem, the fundamental, the deep-rooted problem, patriarchy is embedded in capitalism. But how old is capitalism and what existed before capitalism? Patriarchy is the root of all evils. It is where everything is seated, because it began and it became and it manifested itself in various ways. And if this capitalism will morph into various different forms to suit itself. And if we look in this very room, on the panel here, there are two people who come from matrilineal societies. Myself, my mother, the Nayars from Kerala in India, a Nayar from Kerala in India, and who knows how many people. All across the world, there are these people from matrilineal societies / matriarchal societies. And what are we learning from them? Instead, we are mimicking this very systems of power that we are trying to dismantle in the ways in which we do our consciousness and the ways in which we speak, etc., including and excluding, etc. So that for some of us, it's much more powerful to look to our matrilineal societies and to find therein the language and the instruments and the mechanisms and indeed the laws and the ways of being that have governed us since time began, that ensure the rights of all the people in that society.
Wow. Okay, three quick responses. One on the privilege of the 90s of forging relationships across generations and across movements was funded. So some people say the revolution will not be funded. In the 90s, it was funded. Governments put in a lot of money into supporting advocacy work. And that's what allowed hundreds and thousands to participate and to meet regularly enough that one could generate those kinds of alliances. Those same governments that funded advocacy in that era, and foundations as well, private foundations, shifted after the conference era into funding the so-called solutions. Very narrow, siloed solutions, some technical fixes. So that shift to come back in this period to really look at supporting movements, again, has not quite happened. So that's one of the challenges, Lisa, that is difficult to imagine, that kind of solidarity building that happened in the 90s. But that said, I think there is a lot of very interesting work that is going on through cyberspace, and some in face-to-face meetings that is intergenerational and is also across movements. So it's unfortunately, because of this kind of narrowing of the funding, you're seeing more professional NGOs in the process and less of social movements. So one of the challenges we faced in the NGLS consultation is to engage more of the social movements that are on the streets, that are mobilizing in new ways, that are much younger, and that's a big challenge to interlink that and to hear that vocabulary that's coming from those movements. Not in Spanish, depatriarchalization, that Latin American indigenous feminists are using, language of the territories, defense of the territories from the body to the land, to waterways, to oceans, to states, to communities. I mean, it's Pardon? Decolonization. These are terms that are actually alive and being used today in movements across the global south, and I think we need to pay attention to that vocabulary and to really step a little bit outside of a kind of formal advocacy type language and really pay attention to where those movements are coming from. The second issue in terms of public-private partnerships and what could be, what kind of strategies around this, I think we need to disaggregate and not be careful about or redefine the concept of private sector and really look at the various components of what comprises the private sector. So to pay attention to corporate power is one issue, but to look at the various forms of the private sector, including what came out through the consultations that we conducted and elsewhere, new forms of social solidarity economies, care economies, different forms of the private sector that is generating revenue that is being invested in local development. How do we actually lift that as a pillar of the economy, not as sort of a sideshow to the main economy, to the that real economy should be lifted as a pillar. There's so many issues that are coming up in terms of knowledge production and academia, since we're sitting in an academic context here, well, a mixed, very mixed, but certainly speaking to university context, to see what kinds of knowledge production can serve this, these movements. And one of the things we noticed, along with some key Southern research institutions, is that close to 80% of the knowledge production, the papers that are being written and so on about the post-2015 agenda and so on, are really coming from North-based institutions. So, you know, how do we address this imbalance? And really pay attention, as I said in my first point, of the different vocabulary and the different ways of articulating and a different grounding, and lift those and give that the visibility it needs. Just closing on the matrilineal power, both Radhika and I come from this community actually, and certainly is a source of our strength, but also a source of paradox. In terms of how during the colonial and the post-colonial period, that strength was eroded, and the rights that our foremothers had was eroded. But there are elements of that strength that still exist and that needs to be recovered, I think. And I think with more dialogue, I think, with other parts of the world where you were able to maintain the principles and able to practice and live them, I think there's a lot of learning that needs to happen across the world, but certainly across South-South. And I say this because there's so much experience in Latin America, for example, of resisting the extractive industries, what's called post-extractivism, you know, experience in Africa to create an African mining vision that does not exist in the Pacific or Latin America. You know, how to control illicit capital flows. There's a major panel in the African Union led by Thabo Mbeki. Never mind his history, but still, these are really important regional South-based initiatives that need to be addressed and really are ahead of the global in so many ways. So it's not a race to the bottom at the global, it's really a lifting of experiences across the South and the North. I mean, the experience of cooperative movements in North America is remarkable, you know, and a lot to learn from each other. So I think if we can focus on those kinds of initiatives, whether at the macro level or in communities and that are challenging this PPP framework, the public-private partnerships framework, I think we'll be on a solid grounding, because there is no real evidence that shows that that framework is actually delivering. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So I think the what is it? Something history is on our side. Thanks.
Pardon? Brilliant. The arc is just